Hi, welcome. I'm Dr. Rao. Thank you for joining me for this webinar. I am so happy that you're here, and I'm really excited to talk about one of my favorite topics in education, and that is inclusion. If you have a question at any time, I think like Jamie mentioned, go ahead and type it into the chat box while it's fresh in your mind. I will stop probably 2 times and then again a 3rd time at the very end to answer questions. Also, if you are in one of my classes, I want to make sure that I give you credit for being here. So I'll have a log of who is here, but I won't know exactly what class you're in. So if you could right now type your first and last name and your class, so your name, SPED 533 or 532 or 482, into the chat box. And then I'll have that log to go ahead and give you credit. Okay, and then I think we're going to be posting a poll as well, 2 polls. I would love to know who's joining us. So I'm curious about what your specific role or future role will be, whether you're a special educator or general educator or maybe an administrator. And then I'd also like to know if you're currently practicing inclusion or if you're just here because you're interested in learning more. So I think those polls will be available, and if you could take a moment to complete that, I would love to know. Okay, so a little bit about this webinar before I get started. The information I will be presenting is based on research and literature, as well as my own professional experiences with inclusion. I'm going to be touching on some concepts and practices that I wish so much I could go into more depth, but due to this just being an hour long, I won't be able to. For example, I'll be barely touching on universal design for learning, class-wide peer tutoring, co-teaching. These are all really good practices, but they could be covered in like a full day workshop at least. So I encourage you, if something is interesting and you'd like to learn more, search our library website for articles. All of these practices are research-based. Look for books on Amazon, videos online, and keep an eye out for any trainings on those topics or workshops offered by your district or by the Orange County Department of Education. Now, whether you have been practicing inclusion for a while now, or if you're kind of brand new and you're here to learn whatever you can, I hope that you come away from this webinar with a fuller understanding of inclusion and inclusive practices. And my goal is that you can take away some ideas that you could implement right away, as well as some ideas that are more long-term that you might talk about with your team and plan for in the future. All right, let me go down to the next slide. All right, so my email is on this slide down at the bottom, trao@fullerton.udl. If you think of questions tomorrow or a year from now, I would love to hear from you. I love hearing from you on email, so feel free to email me, and I'm always happy to answer questions as well as hear from you and hear about what you're doing, hear any success stories and things like that. All right, so, whoops, what did I do? There we go. All right, here's the agenda. So we are going to, I'm going to give a little introduction, and I'll talk a little bit about philosophy and some definitions, and then we'll get into practices. First, I'll talk about some problematic practices in inclusion, and then I'll talk about the inclusion package. What are some must-haves for a really good inclusive experience? And some additional strategies and accommodations. I'll touch on logistics and then come back for more questions at the end. And like I said, I'll stop a couple of times in between for questions as well. All right, so again, welcome. A little bit about me. I've been teaching here at Cal State Fullerton for 10 years. I can't believe that. And prior to my job here, I started out as a paraeducator, and then was a special education teacher, an SDC teacher specifically, a special day class teacher in elementary school for many years. And then I also worked as an inclusion specialist and an autism specialist primarily autism inclusion specialist for that as well. Now, inclusion has been a passion of mine since I got my credential here at Cal State Fullerton. I became really interested in the topic after learning about it here, and I made that the focus of my master's project, and then I continued to focus on it in my doctoral program. And in fact, I'm so passionate about inclusion that when I was an SDC teacher, I noticed that we were getting more inclusion cases popping up. And so I wrote up a proposal and proposed the position of inclusion specialist to our director of special education. I was very nervous, but thrilled that she went for it. She presented it to the district board of education and they went for it as well. So that was really cool. And that's how I got the position of inclusion specialist. I created it. So don't be afraid to go after what you want. Be an innovator. You just might get it. You just may fill a need that is in your district, and you might get to do something really cool. I loved being an inclusion specialist. It was a really neat position, although it did not come without challenges. One of the biggest challenges was just dealing with a lot of the fears and uncertainty that particularly general education teachers have, and it's very valid, but sometimes that could translate into having a negative attitude. And that was not easy, but it certainly led to a lot of personal and professional growth. I learned a lot, and I'm excited to share with you now what I've learned from both keeping up with the research as well as professionally what I've learned. One more thing, you may notice that the research on inclusion seems a bit dated. You'll see a lot of my citations, and if you've done any searching of the literature, it's a bit dated. That's because the trend of inclusion research sort of peaked around the late 90s to early 2000s. And then it trended more towards specific strategies, specific practices, such as response to intervention, universal design for learning, co-teaching, and a lot more. Now, those don't necessarily say inclusion, but they are very inclusion friendly. They work very, very well for inclusion practices. So that's why it's not that we're not practicing inclusion anymore. It's not that we're not interested. It's just that the trend sort of peaked. And now if you search for recent literature on inclusion, you're going to notice that a lot of it is coming out of other countries. And that's because some other countries are just starting inclusion. It's a brand new idea to them. So that research can certainly be insightful, but every country's educational system is so unique that it's not always exactly applicable, but it can certainly be interesting. But my advice, if you're planning to, let's say, do your master's project or thesis on inclusion, I would encourage you to, I know we really push for recent research, the most recent you can find, but I would encourage you with this topic to look at some of those older, more seminal pieces of literature and articles and include those because the information is still very relevant. And then also integrate some of the newer research that's on inclusion-friendly practices like RTI and co-teaching and things like that, even if they don't have that inclusion verbiage tied to them. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to start with philosophy. All right, and I will start with the anti-inclusion arguments. I wouldn't say there's really an anti-inclusion philosophy, it's more anti-inclusion arguments. These arguments tend to revolve around fear. They tend to revolve around fears that having a student with a disability in a general ed classroom will disrupt the learning environment. It will be a financial burden to the school and to the district, and it will present too much of a burden to the general ed classroom teacher, and that perhaps the student with disability might miss out on more intensive instruction that they could receive in a separate setting. So let me talk about those. In terms of being disruptive to other students, things about other students, I'm going to get to that on the next slide. Financial burden, I have not seen research one way or another on that. My guess is that it probably evens out. because it's really different on a case-by-case basis. Just like if we're educating someone in a separate setting, it's going to be totally different on a case-by-case basis. But I have also seen on the flip side arguments saying, oh gosh, you know, districts just want to practice full inclusion to save money so that they can let go of teachers. So neither of those I have seen supported in the research or really even addressed in the research. And I think it's because it would just be really hard to measure that. But in terms of peers without, or no, I'm sorry, in terms of the bottom one, students with disabilities miss out on more intensive instruction. Yes, that can be a problem if inclusion teams are not utilizing best practices and putting proper supports in place. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that is something to watch out for. And that is a problem that can occur and has been documented in the research when they're not using best practices and supports. And then the other one, a burden to the general ed teacher. I'll talk about that one in a couple of slides. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So arguments about or concerns about peers without disabilities. Will it reduce, these are the most common questions, will it reduce the academic progress of peers without disabilities? Will they lose teacher time and attention? And will they learn undesirable behavior from students with disabilities? There is limited research in this area, but the research that we have indicates that no, these are not problems. And certainly from the teachers that I've talked to, and also if you search online and look at, you know, stories that teachers are writing about, I overwhelmingly hear about the benefits to peers without disabilities, that it helps them be more open-minded, it really helps them develop better helping behaviors and have more compassion and acceptance. All right, now the pro-inclusion. All right, whoops, there we go. Pro-inclusion philosophy. I'm just gonna kind of go over this. So basically, the pro-inclusion philosophy is that inclusion is a deeply held belief that that all children are valued members of the school and classroom community, and that by helping students learn to live, work, and play together, the goal is that everyone can successfully live, work, and be together in the community as adults. That's really the heart of the inclusion philosophy, is not only benefiting every student, including the student with the disability and the other students in the class, but creating a better society. That's really at the heart of the pro-inclusion philosophy. Also, inclusion opens up opportunities for friendships that would otherwise never develop if we are segregating our students. Children can grasp diversity in a way that we cannot teach them. And also in terms of teachers, I mentioned before, a concern is that it will be too much of a burden to the general ed teacher. And it is an additional challenge. It means we have to learn more and change the way that we're teaching, but that is very empowering. Although it's a challenge, it can empower teachers to redesign their learning environments, adopt a lot of new strategies so that they can expertly teach all students. And finally, inclusion requires that special and general educators work closely together, and that benefits all children. All right. Okay, so that's about the philosophy. I want to get to the strategies, so I'm kind of going through this a bit quickly. So let's talk now about definitions. So I'm going to start with mainstreaming. I'm going to talk mainstreaming, then full inclusion, and then inclusion as a continuum of options. So mainstreaming is not the same as inclusion, of course, but it's a good place to start. And if you are currently practicing mainstreaming in some capacity, the strategies that I describe here will certainly apply to mainstreaming as well. So mainstreaming is the practice of when a child is in a self-contained classroom or an SDC classroom, then they spend some of the day in a general education classroom, but they're on that SDC roster and they spend part of the school day. It could just be for assemblies and field trips, very minimal, or it could be PE, art, it could even be academics like reading instructions, math, etc. Up to about 50% of the day is what's typical, usually a lot less than that. Now, mainstreaming is not the same as inclusion because the underlying philosophy is different. It's really more aligned with the whole concept of teaching students with disabilities in a separate setting. Because if we didn't have separate settings, we wouldn't have mainstreaming, right? So it's part of that sort of a philosophy. And the unspoken philosophy with mainstreaming is that a student must earn their way into spending time in general education by proving that they can keep up with the instruction and the expectations. Is the student ready to spend time in a general education class? Now, full inclusion and inclusion as part of a continuum, those are different because it's not about whether the student is ready, it's about will the student benefit from spending time in general education. It doesn't matter if they don't have to be ready, it's just will they benefit. So the idea of full inclusion sprang up from grassroots movements by parents of children with intellectual disabilities, such as Down syndrome and other disabilities marked typically by low IQ and low adaptive skills. And those who argue full inclusion means that the child spends 100% of the day in the general education classroom with no pullout, no RSP, no pullout even for speech. All services will be brought to the child in the general ed classroom. That's the definition of full inclusion. Those who argue in favor of full inclusion tend to view separate special ed placements as what have been dumping grounds for the undesirables. Okay, so they have this viewpoint of special education, perhaps have had some very negative experiences. And so that's kind of where they're coming from, is no pullouts, no separate setting, 100% full inclusion. Okay, so that's another piece. And then the other part is inclusion as part of a continuum of options. Now, this is where a lot of researchers would situate themselves. This is what I'm in favor of. Some researchers, such as Fuchs and Fuchs in 1994, discussed how some students, particularly with specific learning disabilities, might fail if they did not have access to specialized instruction delivered by a special education teacher and maybe in a separate setting. So many people argue in favor of a more flexible situation, some more flexible options. So inclusion as part of a continuum, this can encompass a lot of different arrangements. As much as possible, the student should stay in the general ed classroom, but might be pulled out for speech. That especially makes sense if the student needs to do, speech exercises and things like that, where you really just need privacy to do some of those things. Maybe occupational therapy and possibly intensive instruction with a special education teacher and other special ed students in a separate classroom. But the definition generally that's agreed upon, it can vary in the research and by district, but generally it's that the child is on a general education roster, not an SDC class roster, on a general ed roster and spends at least 50% of the day, usually much more, in the general ed classroom. So again, that's not full inclusion, but it's inclusion. And the philosophy here, or actually, what we're really talking about when we're looking at these kinds of, when we're calling it inclusion, often we're talking about students that have more intense needs. Perhaps a student that you might normally assume would be in an SDC class, but now we're putting that student in a general ed class. So when we talk about inclusion, we're usually talking about a student with a more moderate to severe disability. We're not usually talking about the child who just gets speech twice a week or RSP 30 minutes a day. Certainly we can still apply inclusion strategies to those cases, but when there's a whole inclusion team and several supports in place, often including a one-on-one or an extra classroom aide, maybe an inclusion specialist overseeing the case, that's typically a student with more intensive needs. But the bottom line is, inclusion is part of that philosophy. Would the student benefit from inclusion? And what's the best way to set that up and configure that so that they're getting social benefit, but we're not letting their academic needs slide either. Okay, so those are just a few different things to look at. And then I'm going to talk about problematic practices, but maybe before that, I'll see if there's any questions. All right.
And feel free to use the chat if you want to ask any questions at all, or you can write unmute, so I can unmute you. You can also ask the questions that way also.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Just looking a copy of the slides. So yes, you should have a copy of the PowerPoint, but if you didn't get a copy for whatever reason, then you can email me and I'd be happy to send that to you. Oh, and I see Jamie already answered that.
Yeah, if you guys are, if you didn't RSVP or didn't get it, feel free to put your email below, and then I'll slowly start sending everybody the copy of the PowerPoint as we speak.
All right, perfect. Okay. All right, so that's it for now. Okay, so all right, let's talk about some problematic practices, and then we'll get into better practices. All right, so the first one is viewing inclusion only as a location and forgetting about the supports that are necessary. So like I mentioned, there has been some research that has documented that inclusion can actually reduce the amount of intensive instruction, specialized instruction that a student with a disability gets. And when that happens, it's because they're viewing inclusion only as a location. So some school districts, particularly when it was a bit newer, like in the 90s, a newer idea, some school districts were like on it. They're like, oh my gosh, yep, we're gonna jump right in, we're gonna do this. They had a great positive inclusive philosophy in place, and they placed students with disabilities in general ed classrooms, got rid of separate settings. They embraced the students, embraced the philosophy, and provided them with a good quality general education. But the problem is they erased the special out of special education. They erased the I out of IEP. And that's a problem because there's a reason that we have the I and the IEP, right? That was part of IDEA and the whole thing. And we need that in place. So it's not enough just to have the right mindset and the right philosophy in place. That's certainly commendable, but we still need to be addressing individual needs with proper services and support. So that would be considered under supporting. Now I'm going to talk about over supporting. So the use of one-on-one aides, oh boy, this is a very common practice and it can be a very problematic practice. I am going to read something to you right now, really quick. Let me show you on the screen. Let's see. I'm actually going to share I'm going to share really quick. Let's see. Okay, this right here is this article. I'm going to read from it to you for just a minute, just a little scenario that the author paints that I think really illustrates the problems with one-on-one aides. It's called The Golden Rule of Providing Support in Inclusive Classrooms. Support others as you would wish to be supported. I'm just going to leave this up in case you want to write this down because I didn't include this with the materials because I kind of just came across it today. I mean, I've had this I've had this article for a long time, and I used to share it with the one-on-one aides I worked with when I was an inclusion specialist, and it's really good. So let me just paint a little scenario for you that's right out of this article. Consider for a moment that where you work paid someone to be with you, supporting you 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Now imagine that you had no say over who that support person was or how they supported you. This person was present for all of your interactions, escorted you to the restroom, and at times supported you by touching your back or shoulder or manipulating your hands or head. This support person might also give you oral directions for upcoming tasks. How would this support change your relationship with your colleagues? Would you notice a loss of privacy or freedom? Would this person's presence affect your creativity or productivity? Would you feel self-conscious about having someone supporting you? What if you asked him or her for some space and they did not give you any space? What would you do, and do you think you might develop some negative behaviors? All right, let me get back to the PowerPoint now. There we go. Okay, so as you can imagine, first of all, it would feel weird, right? That would be a huge bummer. So think about how our students feel. And some of our students cannot express how they feel about having a one-on-one aide. Granted, some students love their one-on-one aide. They become best friends with them. That's kind of a problem too, though. So let me outline some of the problems from the research. This has been well researched. If you look up Michael Giangreco, let's see. Yep, there he is. His name is right there. He and his colleagues from the University of Vermont have done a ton of research, and it's really, really interesting and good stuff. So if you want to learn more, you can look him up. Here are some of the problems that he has outlined in his research. One-on-one aides tend to become glued to their assigned student. You may have heard the term Velcro aides, when they're just stuck on their student. This creates an over-reliance on their help and can completely halt the student from developing independent skills. Another problem that they have found is that when students have a one-on-one aide, they tend to get less instruction from the classroom teacher. The classroom teacher, particularly the general ed teacher, may already feel kind of ill-equipped to teach a child with a disability. And so they think, oh, thank goodness for Miss Sally, the one-on-one aide. She is so great with him. She's so knowledgeable. She knows just what to do. I don't know what to do, so I'm going to stay out of their way and let her handle it. That's a problem because paraeducators are uncredentialed and often untrained and largely unsupervised. Now, they may have developed some good skills on their own, but what happens is that our highest need students, our hardest to teach students, are spending the majority of their instructional day with untrained, uncredentialed adults. And that's not fair to them. That's not the level of education that we want to be giving our neediest students. And then, as you can imagine, one-on-one aides create a wedge between their student and the student's peers. First of all, it's not normal. It's not a normal part of childhood to have an adult right by your side all the time in school. Kids generally don't want to hang out with another kid who comes with an adult. If they do, then that child's probably looking for more adult attention and not really looking to hang out with the child. So research shows also that when a child has a one-on-one, other kids tend to talk to the one-on-one instead of the child. So they might say, oh, you know, what's his favorite TV show? Is he in any sports? Instead of just talking to that child. So if our purpose of inclusion is to have better social interactions, then a one-on-one aide is really has the potential to interfere with that goal. It creates a stigma that's very stigmatizing to have this adult by you all the time. So in summary, one-on-ones can interfere with the child's independent development, time with credentialed teachers, and social interaction. Instead, Researchers, such as Gian Greco, recommend designating classroom aides rather than one-on-one aides, so that an adult is available in an inclusive classroom to provide additional support and supervision to all students, with an emphasis on the students with disabilities, always keeping one eye on the one or couple or few students with disabilities in the classroom, being ready to assist them when needed, but also stepping away, giving that child some space to have a normal educational experience, some space to learn independently and interact with peers, and assist some other students in the classroom that might need some help. This is far less stigmatizing and provides some benefit to the whole class and more benefit to the student with a disability. And then finally, the last problematic practice I'm going to talk about is inclusion that's actually exclusion. I'm sad to say that I've seen this in practice. And this is where you go into a classroom and the child is sitting in the back at like a separate table with their one-on-one aide, doing separate work all day long and being minimally included in classroom activities. So that's not what we want either, right? That is not inclusion. The student would probably be better off in an SDC class where they're a full contributing part of the classroom than in this exclusion-inclusion type of an experience. Okay, so those are some of the problems that can pop up. Oops. All right. So now I'm going to talk about the inclusion package must-haves. Now that we know what not to do, what do we do? Now, several things need to be in place in order for inclusion to really thrive. However, if you are in a situation where maybe your school doesn't quite have all of these things in place or accessible to you, maybe all of these things aren't quite possible at this point in time, you can still create a positive and impactful inclusion experience just by implementing what you can for right now, and then planning for the future to hopefully get some of these other things in place. All right, so let me go through each one. The first things first, a discussion needs to take place. If it's a whole school kind of a thing, where your whole school is implementing inclusion, then it needs to be a discussion with the whole faculty and staff. If it's just a few classrooms, then certainly within each inclusion team. There needs to be discussion about shared vision and values. Here are some examples up here on the PowerPoint. Of some values that might be a topic of discussion among any inclusion team. In fact, an inclusion team might decide on sort of one core value that they're really going to focus on. It might be all children can learn. It might be we will do everything we can to ensure that each child learns well. They might choose sort of one statement or write a mission statement with maybe a few sentences in it. And that is their shared vision. And that's really what's going to ground the inclusion team and keep them sort of on track when things get a little bit challenging. It helps you to remember why you're doing this. And when having this kind of a discussion, it's also important to talk and share openly any concerns and fears that anyone might be having, so that those can be put out in the open and addressed. When concerns and fears are not sort of talked about and validated, then they have a way of festering, and then that might negatively impact the inclusion. Also, there must be collaboration. Inclusion is more than just a really great general ed teacher with a big heart doing their best to educate all children. That's awesome, and I love that, but even the best teachers should not have to do it alone. No matter how great someone's teaching is and how great of an attitude they have, inclusion is most dynamic and impactful when it's a collaborative team approach. Now, an inclusion team can look different from case to case, but would always include a general ed teacher, a special ed teacher, the school principal, and parents. And then often the team will also include the school psychologist, perhaps, any other service providers, and maybe an inclusion specialist, maybe a district special ed administrator. Typically, inclusion teams should meet regularly. Again, depending on the case and the intensity of student needs, might be once a month, might be once a trimester. But these are non-IEP, sort of informal meetings to problem solve and discuss how things are going and address any issues, and also celebrate successes. Opening up an inclusion team with celebrating successes is a really great way to get the meeting off to a positive and productive start. The team meeting is also a time to define roles and responsibilities. Now, this would take place at the beginning of the school year. Who is going to do what? Who is responsible for what? And some of those responsibilities should be shared and flexible and overlapping. So the special ed teacher and the general ed teacher might share some roles and responsibilities, and that sort of a thing. And aside from team meetings, the general and special education teachers should also be meeting more frequently, like once a week, touching base in person, touching base over email. And during these times, it can be helpful to go over any upcoming activities or units and see what types of accommodations will be needed. It can be helpful to share inclusion planning forms, share information about the student's disability, break down the IEP for the general ed teacher. As a special educator, you really are the disability expert and resource at your school. So keep that in mind. It's not only your responsibility to educate children, but also to educate others about disability and about working with children with disabilities.
Dr. Rao, I'm going to jump in here. We do have a comment in the chat box.
Okay.
I'll read it to you. Inclusion is a great teaching model, but I'm having such a hard time reaching my K-3 students with all their goals and trying to provide accommodations without enough time in a day. Where can I start to make all of it more manageable and provide effective instructions to all my students? Some of my third graders do not know their letter sounds, and I'm having a difficult time to keep including their ELA instructions, even with some modified curriculum. I would love solid advice.
Okay, that's a great question. And I would say that goes back to we still need to be providing specialized intensive instruction. It should still be part of that continuum of options. And that's what some of the research has found, is that when we try so hard to include students, particularly in reading and math, sometimes we're not addressing the skills that they really need to learn. So that's when practices like RTI really come into play, where you are grouping your students in a flexible way, but grouping them based on their skill set, based on assessments and progress monitoring, so that, when you have a cluster of students that need to work on their letter sounds, then you can work on their letter sounds in a focused, intensive, systematic way. Whereas then there's other groups that are working on their particular skills that they need to work on. Now, the key is to keep this flexible. So if you are doing this in a general education setting, then there might be a mix of students with disabilities, and maybe one or two students that just need to work on that as well. And maybe some of the students with disabilities end up testing out of that group, some stay. So you want to keep it flexible, progress monitoring every month, and then adjusting the groups as necessary. That way, if that's a common practice that you're doing with all students, then you're able to really get focused on the skills that they need to learn. And then for other activities in the classroom, that's when you would mix it up. You wouldn't just be segregating them by ability all day. That's more for those focused ELA skills and maybe math skills as well. But when it's science, when it's social studies, other activities, read aloud, whole group instruction sometimes, then everybody's mixed together. You're going to be doing cooperative groupings. You're going to have more homogeneous groupings at other times. But if you have that RTI in place as a common practice, then you can really accommodate those students better. Okay, great question. So let's see. So I just saw another question, so let me just look at that. If such a meeting about the inclusion and progress monitoring of the student are not something common at the school, what is the best approach to bring this up for discussion? Okay, so that was me many years ago. Inclusion was not something that was very common. Even mainstreaming was not something that was very common. So I started small. And I did start with the students that I knew would be the most successful to ease my fellow teachers into the whole idea of mainstreaming first. I had sort of, you know, a long-term goal in mind. And I thought, what can I do now to get my school more comfortable with inclusion and eventually the district more comfortable with inclusion? So I would say start small. It's not going to happen overnight. See what you can do and where the comfort level is, and then kind of map out your next steps for the future. Okay, so let's see, the teacher planning time, I talked about that. And then another thing that's important is to do observations of your students who are included in a general ed classroom so that you can take some notes and then offer some suggestions. You know, if the student isn't participating or they're zoning out or they're not understanding the instructions, that's where your special education training can come in into play. And you can think, okay, what is something that this teacher could do or the classroom aide could do to help this student with this one particular issue, whether it's a picture schedule or a reinforcement schedule or something like that, then you would offer those advices. All right, so also important is co-planning, which I just talked about, and co-teaching. Now, co-teaching is really a gold standard practice when it comes to inclusion. However, your school might not be set up for co-teaching. It means that administrators kind of have to get on board and help you carve out sufficient time for co-teaching. So you and the general education teacher need time to plan, to teach, and then to reflect on that teaching and plan again. But if you're able to co-teach, you can really give students the best of both worlds. I did co-teaching more when I was an SDC teacher than when I was an inclusion specialist. And I did it by bringing my students, and I didn't have a ton of students. I usually had less than 10, so it worked out. I would bring my students to the general ed class at my grade level, and then we would do station teaching. So I would be at one station, my aide would have another station, and then the gen ed teacher would have another station, and students would rotate. And that was great. I was able to give more intensive instruction to some of the gen ed students who needed it, and then my students were able to really benefit from being in that general ed environment with my support and with the aide support. And the teacher loved it because she got 2 more teachers in her class for that period of time as well. So the next slide, I'm not going to go over it. Most of you have probably learned this already, but the 4 different types of co-teaching, you can look up more online and possibly watch some videos of each. All right, universal design for learning. So there are 3 components to universal design for learning. The idea is that you set up your instruction and your learning environment so that everyone can access the content in a way that makes the most sense to their brain and their learning style. So these are the 3 components: multiple means of representing content. You might use some visual strategies, some oral strategies. Maybe you'll have your students follow written steps or pictorial steps or audio recorded instructions instead of just oral instructions. This is one of those things I'm just touching on, but it's like a whole thing. Multiple means of students' expression of content. That means maybe they're going to write, maybe they're going to illustrate, maybe they're going to speak, maybe they'll have a choice of what they want to do. You might have them complete a chart or create an outline or develop a text-to-speech presentation instead of writing an essay. Maybe you'll give them the option to use the same materials as others, but in a different way. So this could kind of go along the lines of a little bit of an alternate curriculum. While students are doing a math worksheet on fractions, maybe your student who has a more moderate to severe disability is going to locate and circle certain numerals on that worksheet because their goal is to identify numerals in print. So you kind of look at what you're doing and think about, okay, how could my student participate in this but be working on their goals? And then also flexible means of engagement as students learn. So you can think about it like some of us learn best by listening, some of us learn best through reading, some of us learn best by teaching others about what we just learned. Some of us need to write something down to commit it to memory. Others need to repeat it back out loud. Still others need even more sensory experiences, you know, touch, taste, smell to grasp a new concept. So that's what that means, flexible means of engagement. All right, moving on, curricular modifications. All right, so what I don't have up here is an alternative curriculum where your student is maybe working on a totally different goal than everybody else, but they're kind of doing the same worksheet like I just described. But then two other issues, and this is also from Gian Greco, who I mentioned earlier, is multi-level curriculum and curricular overlapping. So multi-level curriculum is when there are different learning outcomes within the same curricular area. So for example, here's what I want to show you for this. I have a lesson planning worksheet that is just perfect for this. Let me pull it up. Ooh, can you see it? What do you see now? I don't know. Where did it go? Here it is. Okay. Jamie, what do you see on the screen right now?
I see the unit planning form.
Oh, great. You just see that? Okay, perfect. I see like all of my documents. Okay, so this unit planning form is great for multi-level curriculum planning. At the bottom here, you list what all students should learn. So let me use an example, like let's say you're teaching a unit on frogs and the frog life cycle. So maybe you think all students could learn to sequence the frog life cycle, right? So even a student with a more moderate disability could learn the frog life cycle and maybe put pictures into a sequence, and maybe also identify the parts of a frog's body or something like that, what all students will learn. And then here in the middle, you have what most students will learn. So this is like your typical lesson plan, what you think most kids can learn. Maybe the student with the more moderate to severe disability is just gonna get this part, but then you have this part that you're teaching as well. And then what some students will learn, these are like maybe your high achievers, where you think they can take it to a next level or go a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's kind of one example of multi-level. Back to my PowerPoint. And then curricular overlapping. This is when you're going to address multiple goals in your lesson. So let's take, for example, a science lesson, a hands-on science activity where students are going to work in partners or work with groups. So you might be addressing certain science objectives, and then your student or a couple of students also have some social goals or group work goals working with others. So you're also going to address that more functional curriculum within your science lesson. So those are a couple of curricular modifications to consider. And the research is also very clear that it's important to have staff development for all teachers. And then, of course, you really need to be training those paraeducators. Now, paraeducator as you can imagine, this is really important to avoid some of those problems that I mentioned before. They need training. And training can come in different forms, like formal training at the school district, or it can come from you one-on-one. I used to put on an after-school training once a week for a few weeks for our one-on-one aides, and it was voluntary. The school district couldn't pay them for the extra time, but we got a lot of aides come who just wanted to learn more. They were hungry for it, and they appreciated having this training. I ran it just like I would run one of my lectures here, where I would talk about a topic, and then we would discuss it as a group, and then I would teach some specific strategies, and we'd practice that strategy. And I'd also work with my aides when I would do observations as an inclusion specialist, and just whenever I could. Also, along these lines, I wanted to mention peer training. So let's see, is that the next one? Oh, yes. So yes. It's also important to support peer relations. I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to have to kind of go quickly through some of this. So, you can look up ideas for like a lunch bunch or a Super Friends program. That's something that I used to do at lunchtime once a week. I would have a couple of students with disabilities join me, and then I would open it up as a choice to other students without disabilities. I'd kind of advertise it in certain classrooms that if they want to join me for lunch and play some games during their lunch hour, there's actually a lot of students who would love to spend time with a teacher in the classroom during lunch playing games. So that's what I did. And then I could address all kinds of things, all kinds of goals, social goals, and just support more peer relations between students with disabilities and without disabilities. And then finally, I would do disability awareness lessons. So what I found was, particularly in one case, I had a student with Down syndrome in a general ed second grade class, and she was performing about at a preschool level. And the students were open to having her, but they were also very confused by some of her behaviors. She wasn't yet toilet trained, so she wore pull-ups, and they noticed that. And sometimes she would not behave very kindly because she had very low verbal skills. It was hard to understand her. And so they did one of two things. They were either responding to her with anger and getting frustrated with her, or they would try to mother her and almost treat her like a baby. I didn't want any of those things to be happening. Instead, I wanted, for her to have better peer relations. So I went in and I did a disability awareness lesson with the whole class. I had the aide take the student out. I think maybe we did it during speech time. And then I taught the students about Down syndrome. I went into the genes and the chromosomes, and, I really planned on how to explain it to them in a way that they could understand. And then I talked about why she has some of these specific behaviors and why she's wearing pull-ups. I opened it up for any questions that they have, and it was really a great time for them to just talk about these questions they've had on their mind, but they didn't think they could ask. And then I talked to them about how they could be a good friend to her and how they could support her in better ways. So I really recommend that. It really helped with some of these issues that we were seeing. In your materials that you were sent, I also included a lesson like that, but that lesson that I included is non-specific. So when I had students with autism, sometimes very high-functioning autism, they still had some behaviors that were weirding kids out. And so I went in, but as a team, the inclusion team decided we don't want to, by the way, you need to get parent permission to talk about the student's disability because that is confidential. But the parent was very happy to give me permission even to talk about Down syndrome. But with autism, we decided we don't want to throw out the label of autism. It's going to be too confusing. They're going to go home, start telling their parents, oh, so-and-so has autism. And we don't really want that for that. Autism is an invisible disability, so it's a little bit different than Down syndrome. So instead, I did a more general lesson on acceptance and compassion, and when kids have different behaviors and different issues and things like that. So I did send out, or Jamie sent out in the materials, an example of a lesson like that you can look at.
Dr. Rao, there is a question that came up in the chat.
All right.
Asked, how often throughout the school year would you recommend holding outside training for aides?
I would say as often as you can, as often as is feasible. I think I did it maybe twice a year, like after school for a month, once a week. I think I did that twice in one school year. And that's just kind of what was feasible for me and for the aides. I would also ask my district, can this aide get a sub for the day so that I can just work with her one-on-one all day and go over things, or even half a day. I think a lot of times I would do half a day. And lo and behold, they would say yes. So again, don't be afraid to ask, because a lot of times these are really good ideas and the district will see, yeah, this is important. This is a need. Our aides need to be trained. They're very aware of that. It's just a matter of how to make it happen. So if you can propose a viable solution to that, like half-day sub, it's not generally a big deal. And then you can work with an aide or maybe a few aides during that time as well. So I tried to meet with them for a little bit like that, maybe half a day, at least once a school year. But I think twice would be even better. So as much as you can. All right, now some additional strategies and accommodations. Of course, I knew I was going to run short on time. So I'm going to go through this. If you have to go at 7, it's fine. Just go ahead and log out. And like Jamie mentioned, this will be recorded and you can watch it later. So for one thing, you can alter the physical environment. And I recommend making these options available to all students, kind of following that UDL framework, giving choices to all students. So you might give students a choice of, let's say, a study carrel, or a quiet zone to work in if they're easily distractible. And that can go for any student who needs it. You might also give students a choice of like working at a bigger desk or a table if they just need to kind of spread their stuff out, or that sort of a thing. So offering different choices to the physical environment can be really good. In terms of lesson planning, I have included also an article on backwards lesson design. That is a great approach to lesson planning for an inclusion setting. So be sure to check that out. Front loading might be my very favorite strategy. So front loading is sort of a way of pre-teaching and giving students some information ahead of time. So if you know there's going to be a lesson coming up on the Revolutionary War, you might send home a simpler book for the student to read at home with their parents ahead of time. You might send home a link to a video that will introduce them to the Revolutionary War and some of the important topics surrounding that. And so then when they go into the classroom, they will have already had some exposure to it, because a lot of our kids with disabilities, they need more repetition than they're going to get just from a general ed lesson. So front loading is a way to give them a couple of opportunities for more repetition, and then they have more background knowledge going in, and they'll be able to access that content better. Let's see, you can also alter the instructional arrangement. So that would mean, let's say you're having students get into groups of 5. Maybe the student with a disability, you think they'd work better with a group of 3. So make their group a group of 3. Maybe everyone's going to be working independently, but you're going to pair up the student with a disability with a buddy. Maybe a couple of other students too would benefit from that. Or maybe everyone's going to work in independent groups, and so you as the teacher, or you'll have your aide talk to your aide ahead of time about how to sort of sit with that particular group and support them. So that's altering the instructional arrangement. Class-wide peer tutoring and peer-assisted learning strategies. These are another big concept. that I can't fully get into, but I really encourage you to check out the research. Do a search on either of those topics. Tons of research support for these peer tutoring strategies. These are structured peer tutoring that work great. If you've tried it in your student teaching placement or your teaching placement, you already know how great it is. The research supports that these practices can result in higher achievement among students with intellectual disabilities, students with emotional and behavioral disorders, students with learning disability, as well as the general population, English learners, you name it. These are great, great strategies. Think, Pair, Share is another great strategy. You can find a lot about that online. And then peer teaching with designated peer tutors. So there might be times that you're not going to use like a full, whole class-wide peer tutoring thing, but you're just going to have your student work with a peer tutor. Here are some things to keep in mind. The best peer tutors are not just the kids with the highest grades. They need to be kids that have three things in common. They're active class participators. They work hard. They do get good grades, but they put in a lot of effort for it. And they interact well with everybody. They interact well with their peers regardless of like gender or popularity or anything like that. Those make the best peer tutors. Now you want to ask them if they would like to be a peer tutor. Don't just assign this. See if they would like to volunteer for this. And you can use a peer tutor in a number of ways. You can have the helper, have the tutor model how to do a task before the student performs the task on their own. You can train the tutor on how to give additional prompting, how to give immediate feedback and encouragement to the student. And you can have the tutor help the student complete the task, maybe take turns on different steps of the task and sort of co-complete a task or an assignment together. So those are some ways that you can use peer tutors. Now I have some additional specific strategies. And if you notice down on the right side of your screen, I have the link. It's hard to see the link, but if you open up your PowerPoint copy, you can click on the link. It's called the inclusiveclass.com. Tons of ideas like this, you guys, and it's awesome. So this first one is called Spy It. The idea here is that the longer words like wildlife, uproar, headache, teammate, those are the same or similar to the spelling list that the rest of the class is working on. But perhaps this student is really just working on simpler words like wild, up, home, top, well, and out. So you highlight those words and then just have the student copy the highlighted words. So they're going to be learning a lot of different skills. You know, they're working on spelling skills, decoding skills, breaking down larger words, locating information. So you can actually hit up a lot of different goals in something like this. This is called Trace It. So using this strategy, perhaps the whole class is learning about the parts of the eye and the function of each part of the eye and some really advanced stuff. And then maybe while they're working on something, you're going to give your students a diagram of the eye and have them trace it and have them write the word eye. Here they're practicing printing, spelling, numbers, diagrams, some new vocabulary. Again, you can hit up a lot of different goals. And then this one is called Find It. So you give them a short passage and then they find where the answers to that passage is. So again, they can cover lots of different goals like identifying information, selecting correct information, and following directions. All right, finally, and this is such a great resource, you guys. You can find a lot of participation strategies. I really recommend you checking this out. There's a ton of videos that demonstrate specific strategies to use that would be really great for inclusions. This is edutopia.org, and it's specifically the part called How Learning Happens. All right, so, and then, this, you guys, you have this, but you can also go to the website down at the bottom. but you have this as part of your materials that Jamie sent you. I love this poster. It's free. You can print it out, put it up in your classroom. This would be a great way to have a discussion with your class about diversity and inclusion and how fair does not mean equal. Fair is not always equal, right? Different students have different needs. It gives this great example where it's kind of like doctoring. You know, this child scraped their knee, this child's stomach hurts, this child has a cough, this child's arm is broken, and then you give them all cough medicine, right? That would not be fair. It would be equal, but not fair. Each child needs to get what they need. And so you can talk about that and how that would apply to some of your classroom practices, how some students are going to have different things, because that's what's fair. And finally, logistics. So one of you emailed me last night with some really great questions that I wanted to address. So I added this slide in. This is not in the PowerPoint that you received through email because I just added it in today. And I see the question, is this available in stores? I don't believe it is, but you could click on that website and see if they're selling a kind of a nice, glossy poster. I know it's printable, but I don't know about if it's available for purchase. Okay, so logistics. How many students with disabilities should be included in one general ed classroom? It depends on the disability. If it's a more moderate to severe disability, I would say I actually see a lot of benefit to having more than one, particularly for the student. Because think about if you had a more moderate to severe disability, you would feel very different from everyone. You would see that everyone has an easier time with just about everything. And it really is nice for us as human beings to see ourselves in other people and have some people that are like us. We naturally are drawn to friendships with people that we can relate to. And so I think it's great to have 2 or 3 students in a classroom, but no more than that, especially if you have 30. It shouldn't be more than like 10%. However, if it's learning disabilities, I see benefit to having more because that's when you can really focus on their skills in like an RTI kind of a thing. Now, I know there's some discussion like we shouldn't be clustering students all in one class, but sometimes there can be some benefit to that. I really don't see any, it kind of makes sense as long as you're having flexible groups, like I said before, and you're progress monitoring, and you're not keeping them together all the time. But for that focused instruction, let's say you have 5 or 6 kids that are working on very similar goals, then that makes sense. You can really hone in and give those students a very focused small group instruction on those particular skills, but then the rest of the day they're kind of dispersed. So it really varies. It varies by need, by the severity of the disability and things like that. How many students should be on a special ed inclusion teacher's caseload? So here's what I recommend for determining that, because it could really vary. One teacher might have like 20 would be too many, but maybe 15 on their caseload, and another teacher would have 10, but it's fair because the teacher with 10, those students have way more intense needs. And maybe a teacher would have 20, but they're like very low, low need students. So what I would do is look at a caseload, look at a group of students, take some time to map out how much time per week is required from you as a special ed teacher. Add that up and then look at how many hours per week you're paid. Because here's what it should never be. It should never be, oh my gosh, I have all of these students, and in order to meet their needs, I have to work overtime with no pay. And if I don't do that, then their needs don't get met. That is not fair. So if that's the situation, I would really document how much, here's what each student needs, here's what's on their IEP, here's how many hours I'm paid to work. What should we do about this? Definitely bring that up and have a conversation about that. And that would be the best way to determine your caseload. Finally, how many different grade levels should be assigned to one inclusion teacher? I think, again, that can vary. When I was the inclusion specialist, I had like K through 8, but I didn't have a ton of students, and I was also doing that as a part-time part of my job. I don't remember, I might have had 10. But some were more high need and required more of my time than others. So how many different grade levels? I'm guessing that your situation, the person who asked this, is that you're at like a whole school that's practicing inclusion. I would say it would make sense to have one teacher with the K through 3 with primary and one teacher with upper grade. If you've got more students than that, then maybe more teachers on each end, or divided up like every 2 or 3 grades. But again, that would be really a discussion that you would have with your school and figure out how much time is needed and how much time do we have. Okay, so any questions? We have reached the end, and I only went 11 minutes over. Okay, that's better than I thought. So any remaining questions that you have, go ahead and type them into the chat box, and I'd be happy to answer those. And if there are no questions, then I guess we'll wrap this up. And like I said, feel free to email me anytime, and I would love to chat with you over email.